Before the assault begins, there is always a morning. It comes the same way it always has, grey light pressing through the arrow slits, pigeons stirring on the chapel roof, the smell of wood smoke and damp wool and the particular sourness of unwashed bodies too long in too small a space. Children wake, dogs stretch in the straw. Somewhere in the lower town, a woman is already at the well, drawing water with the same rope-burned hands she used yesterday and the day before that. For a moment, just a moment, it feels ordinary. Then the bells begin. Not the slow devotional toll of the canonical hours, not the measured peal that calls the faithful to lauds or terce or vespers. These bells are hammered, not rung, frantic, staccato, the sound of a city that has just learned something terrible is moving toward it across the open plain. In the market square, traders who had already laid out their morning goods, cabbages, dried fish, bolts of undyed wool, begin to scoop everything back into their carts. No one argues about weight or price. No one haggles. A man drops a crate of live chickens and does not stop to retrieve them. The birds scatter into the alleyways and no one chases them. A siege is not something that happens all at once. It arrives in pieces like a tide that has been rising for days without anyone quite admitting it. First come the rumours. A patrol that didn't return. A merchant from the eastern road with eyes too wide and a story told in fragments. Then come the refugees, streaming in through the gates in ones and twos and then in crowds, carrying what they can on their backs, their faces wearing that specific expression of people who have already lost everything and are still not sure they understand it. Then come the fires on the horizon, and the smell of smoke that isn't from any hearth in the town, and the scouts returning on lathered horses with news that confirmed what everyone already knew. And then the gates close. When those gates close, something fundamental changes. The town, which had always been, however, provisionally, part of a larger world connected to markets and roads and the ordinary flow of human commerce, becomes a world unto itself. Everything that exists within these walls is now all there is. Every loaf of bread already baked. Every barrel of salted fish in the storerooms. Every arrow in the Fletcher's workshop. Every face you have ever known in this place. This is your world now, exactly as it stands in this moment, and it will shrink from here. The name of this place doesn't matter. It could be any of 100 towns across medieval Europe, a market centre in the Rhineland, a fortified commune in northern France, a hilltop borgo in the Italian Marches, a river town on the contested borders of the Polish principalities. The century matters less than you might think. Between the fall of Rome and the dawn of gunpowder, the experience of a besieged town was remarkably consistent across time and geography. The same fears, the same shortages, the same social fractures, the same daily negotiations between courage and despair. What follows is the story of what it actually felt like to be inside. Not the story told by chroniclers writing from the comfort of monasteries, measuring events in dynasties and treaties. Not the account favoured by military historians, plotting supply lines and siege engine trajectories. The story told by the garrison soldier who hasn't slept in 2 days and whose hands shake when he knocks his arrow. The story told by the baker trying to stretch half a sack of rye flour into enough loaves to feed 200 people. The story told by the woman watching her children's faces for the first signs of fever, counting the days, watching the walls. This is where the stones bled. The daily terrors of a besieged medieval town. The first hours of a siege are simultaneously the most chaotic and the most decisive. Every decision made in this window, or failed to be made, will echo through the weeks and months that follow. the town's garrison, its mayor or appointed commander, its leading citizens. They have perhaps 12 hours from the moment the gates close to the moment when the besieging army finishes establishing its positions. 12 hours to assess, allocate, organize, and begin the transformation of a civilian settlement into a military organism capable of surviving what is coming. Most towns in the medieval period were not primarily military installations. They were places of commerce, craft, and habitation, whose walls existed as much to regulate trade and collect tolls as to defend against attack. The garrison, such as it was, might consist of a handful of professional soldiers supplemented by an urban militia of tradesmen and craftsmen, with varying degrees of military training and wildly inconsistent equipment. The man who checked the portcullis mechanism yesterday was also, until this morning, a cobbler. Within the first hour, the town's leadership would typically convene in whatever served as the administrative centre, whether a dedicated guild hall, the mayor's residence, or simply the largest room of the most important man in the settlement. What followed was often less a council of war than a barely controlled negotiation between fear, expertise, and competing self-interest. The military commander, if there was one, which was not always guaranteed, would be assessing the wall's condition, the state of the garrison, the available weapons and munitions. How many men could actually fight? How many of the militia could be trusted to hold a section of wall under sustained pressure without breaking? Where were the weakest points in the fortifications? Had the cisterns been checked? When were they last fully replenished? The town's leading merchants and guild masters, meanwhile, were thinking about their storehouses. Every community that faced a potential siege had theoretically certain protocols for stockpiling supplies, but theory and practice were frequently strangers to each other. The cellar beneath the chandler's shop that was supposed to hold a month's reserve of tallow was, upon investigation, occupied primarily by the chandler's personal wine collection. The granary in the market square that appeared full from the outside contained, in its upper third, nothing but air and a family of rats. The inventory was almost always a reckoning. The accounting of a town's food supply at the beginning of a siege was a document that almost no one wanted to be responsible for producing. It required an honest assessment of how many mouths were now inside the walls, including all those refugees who had streamed in from the surrounding countryside, whose numbers no one had properly counted, and whose appetites had not been factored into any pre-crisis planning. It required a realistic estimate of how long the siege might last, which required a military intelligence that most town authorities simply did not possess. And it required the courage to translate those numbers into decisions that would make enemies. Because rationing had to begin immediately. Medieval towns under siege did not have the luxury of easing into austerity gradually. Waiting to impose rationing, hoping the situation would resolve itself quickly, not wanting to alarm the population unnecessarily, deferring to powerful citizens who had comfortable private reserves and preferred to think the rules applied to others, was one of the most consistently documented failures in siege accounts across the period. Towns that waited to ration typically found themselves in catastrophic shortage within 3 weeks. Towns that imposed strict rationing from day one could sometimes hold for months. The psychology of this decision was brutal. Announcing rationing on the first day was an admission that the siege would last. It induced panic. It invited accusations that the leadership was defeatist, had already given up hope, was planning to surrender. Wealthy citizens with their own private stocks of food resisted fiercely. By what authority, they demanded, would anyone compel them to surrender what was rightfully theirs? The church complicated matters further, since monastic institutions within town walls often controlled substantial food stores that they were reluctant to release to secular authority. Simultaneously, in the first 24 hours, the garrison would begin its transformation of the civilian town into a defensive apparatus. Citizens would be impressed into work details. The elderly, the infirm, children old enough to carry. Everyone contributed. Stones were hauled to the wall walks to be dropped on attackers. Cauldrons were moved to positions where water or sand could be heated and poured through the murder holes above the gates. The roofs of buildings immediately adjacent to the walls, which attackers might use to access the defences, or which might be set alight by incendiary projectiles, were sometimes torn off preemptively, their timber repurposed as construction material for barricades or repairs. Every church in the town would have been packed with people praying that first day, not abstractly, but with the specific, urgent, transactional piety of people making very concrete requests. Every shrine would have candles lit before it. Relics, the bones of saints, the fragment of the true cross, the vial of holy water from a pilgrimage site, would be brought out and displayed. The clergy understood their role in this moment. They were not merely providing spiritual comfort, but performing a social function, giving the community something to do collectively, a ritual of solidarity in the face of a threat that felt impossibly large. By nightfall on the first day, the town would already be a different place than it had been at dawn. The gates were closed, the inventory was being taken, the prayers were being said, and outside the walls, visible from every tower and every high point in the town, the enemy was settling in for a long stay, lighting fires, pitching tents, beginning to construct the infrastructure of a prolonged operation. They were not in a hurry. They could afford not to be. That realization that the people beyond the walls were patient, organized, and prepared to wait was perhaps the first true terror of a medieval siege. Not the assault, not the battering rams, not the catapults, the waiting, the sense that time itself had become a weapon aimed at the town's heart. The stones were cold, the fires burned, and somewhere in the town a child was asking its mother when they could go home, and the mother did not have an answer. To stand watch on the walls of a besieged town was to inhabit a particular kind of time. The military accounts of medieval sieges tend to focus on the dramatic episodes, the assault, the mine, the sortie, the moment of breakthrough or relief. What they rarely convey is the texture of the ordinary days, the hours stretching into weeks, that were not dramatic at all, but were in their own way profoundly difficult to endure. The garrison soldier who lived through a siege of any significant length spent the vast majority of his time not fighting, but waiting, standing, watching, listening to his own thoughts in the cold dark and trying not to hear what they were telling him. A typical wool watch in a besieged medieval town lasted 4 to 6 hours at a time, depending on the size of the garrison and the number of men available to rotate shifts, in theory. In practice, as sieges extended beyond their expected duration, and illness began to reduce the effective fighting strength, watches lengthened and rotations became less reliable. Men who were supposed to be sleeping found themselves called back to the walls before they had rested. Men who should have been relieved 2 hours earlier were still at their posts because the man who was supposed to replace them was down with fever, or had been assigned to a repair crew, or had simply not appeared. Sleep deprivation was one of the siege's most insidious weapons, because it required no effort from the besieging force whatsoever. The besieging army could attack at any time. That was the point. Dawn assaults were particularly favoured when defenders were at their most mentally sluggish and the light was at its most deceptive. Night assaults were employed to exploit exhaustion and confusion. Even the threat of attack had value. If the defending garrison believed an assault was imminent, they could not afford to stand down their walls, which meant they could not sleep. An army camped comfortably outside with reserves resting in shifts could maintain pressure on a garrison that had no such luxury without expending a single arrow. Medieval commanders understood this dynamic. The chronicles of sieges across the period make repeated reference to feints, apparent preparations for assault that were designed not to actually breach the walls, but to force the defenders to full alert, depleting their energy before the real assault came at a moment of the attacker's choosing. Drums and horns sounded in the night. Cavalry moved demonstrably toward the gates. Fires were lit in positions that suggested sappers were at work. The garrison would pour to their posts, and nothing would happen, and they would wait, tense and wakeful, through the long night. By morning they would be a little more worn down than they had been, a little slower, a little more liable to the errors that sieges punished with death. The walls were not simply a physical structure, they were a psychological one. What did a garrison soldier actually see from the walls? More than his commanders might have wished, and simultaneously less than he needed to truly understand his situation. The besieging army's camp was typically established beyond effective bull range, beyond the fire of the town's artillery if it had any, which meant that the defender on the walls could observe, in rough detail, an enormous amount of activity that he could not interfere with and could not entirely interpret. He could see tents and shelters going up. He could see horses and carts moving. He could see, if he was high enough and the weather permitted, men digging. But was that a latrine trench or a mine approach? He could see timber being hauled from surrounding forests and cut, but was it for construction of siege engines or for firewood? The intelligence problem of a besieged garrison was acute. Without functioning scouts, without the ability to send men outside the walls through the enemy perimeter to observe and return with information, the garrison was essentially blind to everything happening beyond arrow range. Rumour filled the void that intelligence left empty, and rumour was almost always worse than the truth. The man on the wall who saw a large group of the enemy's soldiers moving purposefully toward the eastern approach had no way to know whether they were mounting an assault, conducting a supply run, moving to reinforce another position, or simply changing their camp's spatial organization for reasons of sanitation. Each possibility carried wildly different implications. The natural human tendency, in conditions of threat, uncertainty, and exhaustion, was to default to the worst interpretation. This kept men at full alert. It also drove them toward a particular kind of mental fragmentation. Below the wall, in the town streets and workshops and homes, life was being reorganized around the reality of the siege. But for the man on the wall walk, that life existed in a different register. He was separated from it by both physical elevation and psychological distance. His job was the wall. His world had contracted to his section of the battlement, to the plain beyond, to the movements of the men he was watching, and the state of the sky above them. Garrison duty in extended sieges produced a documented phenomenon that medieval writers struggled to name but clearly recognized, a kind of numbing withdrawal, a progressive detachment from normal emotional life. Men who had entered the siege anxious, talkative, and reactive became, over weeks, quieter and harder to read. They performed their duties with mechanical reliability. They ate what they were given without complaint, slept when they could, returned to the walls. Some chroniclers described this as commendable stoicism. Modern scholars reading the same accounts recognized the symptoms of what we would now call acute stress responses: dissociation, depression, developing under sustained threat conditions. Some men found their way through religious observance, the structured rhythm of the canonical hours, the performance of familiar prayers, gave the day a shape that the siege itself was designed to dissolve. Others found it in companionship, the specific close-knit bonds of men living in shared danger, the dark humour that soldiers across all periods have developed as a survival mechanism against circumstances that have no other humorous dimension. And some men broke. Desertion from besieged towns was a persistent problem that military commanders addressed with consistent severity precisely because it was so predictable. The penalty for abandoning one's post or attempting to flee the walls was typically death, summary execution carried out publicly, both as punishment and as deterrent. Chronicles record numerous instances of men being hanged from the walls in view of their fellows after being caught trying to slip out through sewers, drainage channels, or gaps found in the masonry. The grim calculus that produced desertion was straightforward. The man who could no longer believe that the town would survive, who could see no future beyond the walls that enclosed him, who was perhaps driven by worry for family members somewhere outside. That man was weighing a certain death inside against a possible death outside, and the outside began to seem better odds. Not all of them who tried to leave were cowards. Some were just men who had calculated clearly. The wall kept enemies out, but in the logic of a siege it also kept defenders in. And the psychological weight of that inversion, of a structure built for protection that had become a kind of cage, was something every long siege eventually pressed into consciousness. Food defines a siege more completely than any weapon. The battering ram and the trebuchet are the symbols of medieval siege warfare, but the grinding mechanism that actually determined whether a town survived or fell was almost always the ratio of calories to people to time. Military history tends to focus on what happens when walls are breached. The more common story, the one experienced by the vast majority of people who lived through medieval sieges, was the quieter, slower drama of watching the food run out. Medieval nutritional science was, by modern standards, largely wrong about almost everything except one essential insight. People who did not eat enough died, and people who ate less than they needed became progressively weaker, sicker, and less able to perform the physical tasks on which survival depended. The medieval physician might frame this in terms of humoral imbalance rather than caloric deficit, but the observation was accurate. A garrison that was hungry fought badly, and a civilian population that was starving began to die. The first weeks of rationing, in towns that imposed it competently from the start, were uncomfortable but manageable. The reductions were real but not catastrophic. Perhaps 3/4 of a normal day's intake, enough to create persistent hunger without causing the physical deterioration that deeper deprivation would bring. The foods being consumed were, at this stage, still largely recognizable as food. Bread, though of coarser grain and smaller loaves than normal, dried legumes, salted meat and fish from the storerooms, whatever vegetables the town's own gardens and the small plots within the walls could produce. The social tensions introduced by even this moderate scarcity were, however, immediate and intense. The medieval town was not an economically equal community. Within its walls lived people whose normal diet ranged from the comfortable surplus of the wealthy merchant families who ate meat daily, kept their own kitchen gardens, imported spices from distant markets, to the chronic near insufficiency of the urban poor, who in ordinary times depended on day labour for their meals and had no reserves whatsoever. A rationing system that distributed equally by household, distributed unequally by body, because the wealthy household began from surplus and the poor household began from nothing. And the wealthy, in most towns most of the time, did not submit willingly to equality. The documentary record of medieval sieges is full of disputes over food that broke into open confrontation. The garrison attempting to enter a wealthy household and confiscate hidden reserves, the mob forming in the market square over the rumour of a merchant selling provisions from a private stock at prices that only the wealthy could pay. The town council fracturing along economic lines when the question of whose stores would be requisitioned and whether compensation would be offered could not be answered without making enemies of the people most capable of causing trouble. In some sieges, the social tensions of rationing erupted into actual violence between citizens before the walls were breached. In others, they were managed with the severity that later struck historians as brutal, but that participants understood as necessary. Public flogging for hoarding, confiscation of a merchant's entire inventory, in extreme cases summary execution of individuals whose black market dealings were deemed to have threatened the collective survival. The food itself changed as the siege extended. By the second month, if the siege lasted that long, and many did, the storerooms were beginning to show their true bottoms. The salted meat was gone first, because it was the most expensive to produce and the least likely to have been stockpiled in large quantities. The dried fish lasted longer, but began to develop the rancid, slightly poisonous edge that improperly stored preserved fish acquired after too long in damp medieval conditions. The grain held up best in a dry storehouse, and the decisions about how to husband it, whether to grind it all into flour immediately or keep some in the husk where it stored better, were the kinds of technical choices that could extend or shorten a garrison survival by weeks. And then the supplementation began. This is the element of siege diet that the chronicles mention with a kind of studious neutrality that barely conceals the horror underneath. Every animal in the town that could be eaten was eaten. The horses first, the war horses, the plough horses, the merchants' cart horses, because they were large and expensive and their owners resisted surrendering them until the situation made resistance untenable. Then the oxen, then the mules, then the dogs, then the cats, then, in the sieges that went long enough, things that are harder to categorize. The historical record from sieges of sufficient severity, Jerusalem in 1099, Antioch in 1097-98, numerous conflicts of the 100 Years' War, describes civilian populations eating leather, boiling and consuming the hides of animals slaughtered months earlier, processing old bones repeatedly for marrow. There are references in the most extreme accounts to behaviours that the chroniclers record with a kind of horrified precision that suggests they understood they were documenting something at the edge of what human beings could endure and remain human. The question of when a community's survival ceased to be worth the price of surviving it was one that besieged towns eventually had to confront. Water was a separate arithmetic entirely, and in some ways a more immediately urgent one. The human body can survive weeks without food. It cannot survive more than a few days without water. A town that controlled its own cisterns, wells, and rainwater collection, whose water supply was entirely internal and could not be cut by the besieging force, had one set of vulnerabilities. A town whose water came primarily from a river or spring outside the walls, or that depended on wells that could be poisoned or blocked, faced a potentially catastrophic timeline. The poisoning of water sources was a documented siege tactic. Animal carcasses, and occasionally human ones, were catapulted into defended towns with the specific aim of contaminating the water supply or introducing disease. The defenders understood this. Chroniclers describe frantic efforts to filter and boil water after such attacks, the destruction of obviously contaminated cisterns, the rationing of clean water with the same grim mathematics applied to grain. But even without deliberate contamination, the water quality in a medieval town under extended siege tended to deteriorate. The normal maintenance of drainage and waste management that kept water sources reasonably clean broke down under siege conditions. The increased population density, because of refugees, stressed the town's sanitation infrastructure, and the bodies that siege conditions produced were not always buried promptly or completely, introducing further contamination into an environment that was already under pressure. Hunger and thirst, together, over weeks and months. This was the engine of siege warfare's most consistent victories, and the nightmare that every person inside the walls lived alongside, every day, measuring the diminishing stock of what remained. The sound of a trebuchet releasing was something that, once heard in anger, was never forgotten. Medieval siege accounts are, for the most part, written with a kind of careful restraint about emotional experience. The conventions of chronicle writing favoured the factual over the personal, the strategic over the visceral. But even through that formal distance, certain moments of lived experience break through, and one of them is repeatedly the moment when siege artillery first opens fire on a defended position. The trebuchet, the counterweight siege engine that reached its mature form in the 12th and 13th centuries, could propel stones weighing up to several hundred kilograms distances of up to 300 meters with sufficient force to demolish masonry, breach rooftops, crush anything beneath them. But the weapon that made the chroniclers reach for their most animated prose was less the damage it caused than the sound it made. The deep, resonant thump of the counterweight dropping, the shriek of the sling, and then the half-second of absolute silence during the stone's arc, a silence that the defenders learned to fill with the cold calculation of where it was going to land. The physics were not the worst part. The worst part was the intermittency. The besieging force would typically conduct artillery bombardment in patterns that were partly tactical, targeting specific sections of wall that the engineers had identified as weak points, and partly, whether deliberately or not, psychological. The fire would be sustained for a period, then pause, then recommence, then pause again. The defenders could never know during a pause whether the silence represented a temporary cessation, a technical failure, a deliberate deception, or the end of that day's bombardment. Living under intermittent bombardment, medieval chroniclers discovered, was different in character from living under continuous bombardment. Continuous fire was terrifying, but in a perverse way, legible. The threat was constant, present, and known. Intermittent fire forced the mind to continuously calculate risk in the absence of reliable information. Every moment of silence became a potential precursor to the next impact, and the body's stress response, the elevated heartbeat, the shallow breathing, the hypervigilance, could not be switched off because it could never know when it was no longer needed. People in besieged towns stopped sleeping deeply, stopped eating with concentration. Their thoughts fragmented under sustained artillery. The actual patterns of structural damage that medieval trebuchets and other siege engines could inflict on a walled town varied significantly depending on the accuracy of the weapon, the skill of the operators, the nature of the construction being targeted, and the simple variable of luck. A stone that struck the wallwalk might kill 2 or 3 defenders. A stone that found a gap and continued into the town proper might impact a house, a workshop, a cistern. A stone that fell short struck the open ground before the walls and accomplished nothing. A stone that struck a tower at precisely the right angle might, if everything aligned for the attacker, bring a section of masonry down in a cascade that opened a breach, the moment the entire exercise was aimed at creating. The medical response to siege wounds was conducted within the constraints of medieval medicine, competent in some respects, catastrophically limited in others. The wound itself, the cut of an arrow, the crush of a falling stone, the burn of hot sand poured from the walls above, could often be addressed with varying degrees of skill by the town surgeons or the monks with medical training from the local monastic infirmary. What could not be addressed was infection. The connection between wound contamination and the fevers that followed was understood in observational terms, that dirty wounds went bad, that keeping a wound clean improved outcomes, but the mechanisms were invisible to medieval practitioners, and the interventions therefore inconsistent. A soldier who survived an arrow wound to the shoulder might die 2 weeks later of the septicemia that his healing wound had harboured. A woman injured by falling debris might survive the injury and succumb to the secondary infection introduced while treating it. The medical facilities of a besieged town filled rapidly and never fully emptied. In the early stages, the patients were primarily garrison soldiers injured in skirmishes or during defensive operations. As the siege extended, they were joined by civilians injured in bombardments, by the malnourished whose resistance to ordinary illness had collapsed, by the old and the very young who are most vulnerable to the compound pressures of shortage and cold and stress. The church was almost always the largest available interior space. It became the hospital by default, and in the space between the altar and the ambulatory, amid incense, smoke and prayer, the medieval town's siege experience found its most concentrated expression. The proximity of mortality to faith, of suffering to liturgy, of the specific human body in pain to the cosmic reassurance being offered above it. Whether the reassurance helped is not recorded. The bodies are. Of all the methods available to a medieval besieger, mining was simultaneously the most technically demanding and the most psychologically devastating. The principle was straightforward. Approach the walls of a fortified town by digging a tunnel, undermine the foundation of a tower or wall section, prop the void with timber, then set the timber alight and withdraw. The unsupported masonry above the excavated void would collapse, bringing with it whatever had been built on top. A properly executed mine, against a susceptible foundation on appropriate soil, could bring down a wall tower in minutes, and the breach it created was, unlike one made by artillery, immediately passable at ground level. But for the defenders inside the town, the particular horror of mining was not what happened when it succeeded. It was the not knowing. The standard technique for detecting a mine was to place drums of water or simply basins on the floor and watch for the surface vibrations that underground digging transmitted through the earth. More refined versions involved pressing one's ear directly to the ground or sending children, who were perceived as having sharper hearing, into the lower cellars to listen for sounds in the foundation stones. The sounds were real. Mining operations produced detectable vibrations that experienced defenders could identify with some accuracy. But detection created a problem. Once you knew someone was mining beneath you, what did you do about it? Countermining was the answer, digging your own tunnel to intercept and collapse the attackers. This required skilled miners, typically drawn from the same pool of professionals who worked in the region's metalworking or quarrying industries, and a degree of spatial intuition that bordered on the uncanny. The countermine had to be directed toward the sound of the attack mine, adjusted based on changing vibration patterns, and driven at sufficient speed to intercept before the attack mine could be completed and fired. When two mines met underground, The result was either a negotiated standoff or direct combat in conditions that made the surface world see medieval accounts of countermining operations describe a world of almost unimaginable sensory deprivation and spatial disorientation. Underground, in a narrow tunnel, with only a small torch whose light barely reached the next timber prop, the defender could not know with certainty whether the mine he was intercepting was the only one being dug or one of several. He could not know how far the attack mine extended, whether he was close to where the timber pile would be, whether the attackers had already placed their combustibles and withdrawn. He could not know if the ground around him began to move, whether it was because his countermine had destabilized his own tunnel structure. Some counterminers never came back. They were sealed in by collapses that happened faster than anyone could run, in passages too narrow to turn around in darkness complete enough that even running was guesswork. The garrison that had to send men into tunnels while simultaneously defending the walls above was stretched in a direction that medieval military theory acknowledged as one of the hardest to manage. The mine demanded specialized skills. Not all soldiers were suitable or willing. It demanded a calm that even the bravest men found difficult to maintain in enclosed darkness. And it demanded trust. Trust that the earth above you was not about to descend. Trust that the men at the tunnel mouth would pull you out if something went wrong. Trust that the command decision to send you down there in the first place was sound. Below the town, in the dark and the silence, that trust was tested in ways the wall above never required. Fire was the siege weapon that required no manufacturing, no engineering, no specialist knowledge, and no proximity to deliver. An incendiary projectile, a pottery vessel filled with burning pitch, a bundle of oil-soaked rags alight, a simple pot of Greek fire if the besieger had access to it, could be fired from a trebuchet, launched from a catapult, or in some accounts simply thrown by a sufficient arm, and once it found a wooden roof in a medieval town, the weapon had done everything it needed to do. The rest was physics. The medieval town was structurally a collection of fire hazards arranged in close proximity, timber frame buildings sharing party walls, rooftops of thatch or wooden shingles separated by alleys barely wide enough for two people to pass, workshops housing the materials of trades, the tanner's vats, the smith's forge, the chandler's tallow stores, the fletcher's bundles of dry fletching, that were essentially pre-positioned combustibles awaiting ignition. In the ordinary life of a medieval town, fire was managed through a combination of regulation, vigilance, and luck, and it still broke out with distressing frequency. Under siege conditions, when incendiary attack was a deliberate and ongoing threat, the management of fire became one of the most resource-intensive defensive tasks the garrison faced. Fire watch details were among the most physically demanding and mentally alert assignments available in a besieged town. The men and women assigned to them, because women absolutely participated in firefighting operations, as documented in numerous siege accounts, were positioned on rooftops, in towers, and at street-level stations with access to water or sand. They were required to maintain absolute vigilance through the hours when incendiary attack was most likely, at night, when fire was most visible to the besieger assessing whether the shot had found its target, and at dawn, when the defender's alertness was at its lowest ebb. The detection and suppression of fire in its earliest stages was the critical skill. A burning projectile that embedded itself in a thatched roof and was caught within seconds, smothered with a prepared bundle of wet sacking, doused with a bucket of the water that firewatch stations kept perpetually filled, could be extinguished before it could establish itself. The same fire, left for a minute, was already feeding on the structure beneath the thatch, Left for 5 minutes, it might not be stoppable by any means available. Speed was the margin between catastrophe and merely damage. When fire took hold despite everything, the response became a different kind of operation. Not suppression, but containment. The medieval town's firefighting capability was entirely manual. Buckets, axes, long poles to pull burning material clear of adjacent structures. The most effective technique for stopping a large fire from consuming an entire block was demolition, pulling down the buildings in the fire's path to create a fire break that the flames could not cross, which required people to make very fast decisions about destroying structures that still might have been saved in order to preserve those that certainly would be lost otherwise. These demolition decisions were agonizing. The house being pulled down was someone's home, someone's shop, the workshop that represented a craftsman's entire livelihood and tools. The community's shared resources, civic buildings, the granary, the church, had to be defended even at the cost of private property, which required a degree of authority and community cohesion that could fracture at exactly the moment it was most needed. Some fires were not accidental. In several documented siege episodes, sympathizers within the town, people who for political, religious or personal reasons wanted the besieging force to succeed, deliberately set fires during the night to create confusion, draw defenders away from the walls, and signal the enemy. The detection and punishment of deliberate arson in a besieged town occupied some of the most gruesome passages in chronicle accounts. The suspected arsonist subjected to immediate community justice before any formal authority could intervene. The fire that destroyed neighbours' property and revealed the existence of enemies within the walls simultaneously. Fire from outside, fire from within. The medieval besieged town navigated both, always, and the strain of not knowing which kind of fire a particular night might bring was part of the accumulated weight of siege life that, over months, became almost the heaviest thing of all. Chapter 6b. The Social Fabric. Class, Conflict and Community Under Pressure. Medieval towns were not unified communities before the siege, and the siege did not make them so. The popular imagination of besieged communities, drawing partly on romantic historiography, partly on the narrative convenience of solidarity as a story, tends to picture the shared threat dissolving prior social divisions, creating bonds of common purpose that transcend the usual hierarchies of class and guild and family. This occasionally happened. More frequently, siege conditions intensified existing divisions, created new ones, and forced the governance structures of the town to manage communal conflict at the exact moment when their capacity for governance was most taxed. The economic stratification of the medieval town was, in normal times, managed through a combination of legal framework, social custom, guild structure, and the generally understood hierarchy of who deferred to whom and in what contexts. A master craftsman and a day labourer understood their positions relative to each other through hundreds of daily interactions that reinforced the social order without requiring explicit statement. Siege conditions disrupted all of those interactions simultaneously. The provisioning disputes of besieged medieval towns generated a category of conflict that appears with remarkable consistency across the documentary record from different periods and geographies. The confrontation between the garrison's or council's authority to requisition private food stores and the resistance of property-owning citizens who regarded their personal supplies as inviolable private property. In the ordinary legal framework of medieval urban life, the guildmaster's storeroom was his, the merchant's cellar was his, the baker's reserve grain was his, subject only to the price regulations and quality standards that guild oversight imposed. These were property rights backed by law, custom, and the practical reality that the prosperous classes were the same people who funded civic institutions, served in municipal government, and whose cooperation was necessary for the town to function at all. But in a siege, these property rights collided with the collective survival arithmetic in ways that had no clean legal resolution. Could the garrison commander compel a wealthy merchant to surrender his private grain stores for general distribution? The answer in principle was yes. Emergency powers under siege conditions were recognized as overriding normal property protections in most medieval legal frameworks. The answer in practice was more complicated. The merchant could contest the authority. He could claim the garrison's accounting was wrong. He could appeal to religious authority, to guild custom, to the personal relationships that had always been how things were actually decided in this town. He could also, if he had the social position, simply refuse. And the question of what happened next, whether the garrison commander had the political capital and the physical force to override the refusal, and whether doing so would produce compliance or resistance that damaged the town's coherence at a moment when coherence was critical, was a calculation that played out differently in every siege. There was no version of this calculation that produced no cost. The only question was where the cost fell. The wealthy who were forced to surrender private stores became enemies, or remained enemies, or intensified the enmity that had always been there but had been managed better in easier circumstances. Some used their position in the social hierarchy to advocate, openly or through back channels, for a negotiated surrender, framing it as pragmatic but driven partly by the calculation that their class would survive surrender better than the artisan majority who formed the bulk of the garrison's fighting strength. The poor meanwhile watched and drew their own conclusions about whose survival the resistance was actually serving. Guild solidarity proved more durable than class solidarity in many documented sieges. The craft guilds, organizations that combined economic function with social identity and mutual obligation, provided their members with a form of collective support structure that partly substituted for the kinship networks that siege had disrupted. Guilds organized their own food distribution among members. They maintained internal dispute resolution mechanisms. They provided the psychological infrastructure of belonging and mutual obligation at exactly the moment when the larger community's belonging mechanisms were under maximum strain. The church, meanwhile, occupied its complicated position as both a primary civic institution and a holder of significant material resources. The monastic and episcopal establishments within the town walls typically controlled food stores, buildings, and assets that the secular authorities of a siege needed access to. The negotiation of that access between the garrison commander and the bishop or abbot, whose cooperation would make the difference between a month's supplies and 6 weeks, was one of the most delicate social performances of the siege's administrative life. Some clergy were unambiguously on the side of maximum resistance. Some, for reasons that range from genuine humanitarian calculation to personal relationships with the besieging authority, advocated for surrender. And some simply tried to maintain the church's essential function, the care of the sick, the administration of the sacraments, the provision of spiritual stability in conditions specifically designed to make stability impossible, without committing to a political position they could not privately defend. The rumours that moved through a besieged town were one of its most potent and most dangerous features. In the absence of reliable information about the outside world, about what was happening beyond the walls, about whether relief was coming, about the condition and intentions of the besieging force, Rumour filled the void with the specific content that fear and hope demanded. The rumour that a relief army was 3 days away. The rumour that the garrison commander had received a bribe to surrender. The rumour that the besieging force was running short of supplies and would lift the siege within the week. The rumour that the mayor had negotiated a private arrangement to protect his own property while surrendering the rest. Some of these rumours were true, most were not. All of them had effects regardless of their truth content, because rumour in a closed community under pressure shaped behaviour, and behaviour shaped outcomes. The management of information, what to tell the population, what to withhold, how to address rumours that were undermining morale without inadvertently confirming them, was one of the siege's most demanding and least documented administrative challenges. The commander who said too little bred speculation that filled in the blanks with the worst possibilities. The commander who disclosed too much invited panic or, worse, provided intelligence to any sympathizers within the walls who were in contact with the besieging force. The middle path was narrow, and the social consequences of misjudging it could be catastrophic. Towns whose social fabric held through the stress of extended siege, where the class tensions were managed, where the hoarding disputes were resolved without dividing the community, where the rumours were countered with sufficient credibility to prevent their worst effects, survived longer and in better condition than those where the internal social dynamics collapsed. This was not because morale is a magic ingredient that substitutes for supplies and defensible walls. It was because a community under siege is also a governance problem, and governance problems require a minimum of communal cohesion to address. The siege that broke a town from the inside through the unravelling of its social fabric never required a battering ram. The siege accounts that have survived from the medieval period were written almost exclusively by men about men, garrison commanders, chroniclers attached to military forces, monks recording events from a clerical perspective. The lives of women, children, the elderly, and the non-combatant majority within the walls are present in these accounts primarily when something dramatic enough to note happened to them, when they were killed in a bombardment, when they contributed spectacularly to the defence, when conditions became extreme enough to require their notation. What this means is that we have to read carefully against the grain of the sources to find what was, in practice, the most numerically significant experience of any medieval siege, the experience of the civilians who were not fighting but whose survival was the stated reason for the fighting. Women in besieged medieval towns were not passive recipients of crisis. The practical economics of urban life meant that women were already, in normal times, significant economic actors, managing household provisioning, conducting trade, operating workshops in the artisan trades where female labour was common. When the siege imposed its distortions on the town economy, women's expertise in household management became, in a very direct sense, a military asset. The rationing of food and water, the identification of hidden stores, the stretching of inadequate provisions across the maximum number of days. These were forms of domestic knowledge that women possessed more reliably than men trained for battle, and siege accounts contain numerous references to women being formally appointed or informally recognized as responsible for the distribution of supplies within their street, their quarter, their building. Women also participated in the physical defense of besieged towns in ways that the chronicles record with a kind of surprised admiration that suggests they expected it less than they should have. Boiling water and sand to pour on attackers at the gates, carrying stones to the wall walks for the garrison to use against scaling parties, removing the slain from the wall walk during assaults so the living could maintain their positions. In at least several documented instances from French and German sieges of the 13th and 14th centuries, women fought directly in the defence of breached positions, when the alternative to fighting was the immediate violence that followed a wall's fall. The accounts of what happened to women and children in towns that fell by storm, as opposed to capitulation, are among the most disturbing in medieval military history, and for that reason they were written down. They were not exceptional. They were understood by both attackers and defenders as the predictable consequence of a town forcing an assault rather than negotiating a surrender. This understanding that the women inside the walls were hostages to the town's decision was one of the most effective weapons the besieger possessed and one of the heaviest burdens the defender carried. Children in besieged towns occupied a position that siege commanders across the medieval period periodically confronted as a formal military administrative problem. They consumed resources without producing defensive value. In extreme sieges, the option of expelling non-combatants from the town, pushing women, children, and the elderly out through the gates into the besieging army's lines, was discussed and sometimes implemented. The logic was brutal but legible. Every person expelled was a reduction in the rate of caloric depletion. If the besieging force accepted these expellees, the calculation was straightforward. The problem, documented in several siege accounts with the matter-of-fact horror that medieval chroniclers sometimes mustered for the worst things, was that besieging forces sometimes did not accept them. A commander who wished to prevent the town from extending its survival through the expulsion of non-combatants would simply refuse to receive them, turning the expelled civilians back toward the walls. The town's gates, ordered to remain shut to anyone returning, would not open. The expelled would then exist in the no-man's land between the walls and the besieging positions, neither inside nor outside, neither protected by the siege's conventions nor by any other. The chronicles that recorded this, Antioch 1098, various sieges during the Albigensian Crusade, multiple episodes in the 100 Years' War, did so without the emotional language that would convey what they were describing more powerfully. The absence of that language is not numbness. It is the limitation of a documentary tradition that had not yet developed the vocabulary for civilian catastrophe. The children who survived medieval sieges and lived to old age, whose voices occasionally surface in later records, in pension applications, in testimonies given to legal inquiries, in the margins of documents that were about something else entirely, reported, when they reported anything, not the dramatic episodes but the texture of the ordinary fear, the hunger, the cold, the sounds from outside the walls at night, the adults' faces when they thought they weren't being watched. Medieval military commanders on both sides of a siege understood something that their medical practitioners could not fully explain. The longer a siege lasted, the more the town's population would die from disease rather than from weapons. The relationship between siege conditions and epidemic illness was not mysterious to medieval observers, even if the mechanism remained opaque. The overcrowding of refugees into a settlement already at its population capacity, the deterioration of nutrition, the stress-induced suppression of immune function, the contamination of water sources, the breakdown of the sanitation practices that normally kept the town's disease burden within manageable limits, all of these were observed to produce increased illness. The link to specific pathogens, to the bacteria and viruses that actually caused the fevers and dysenteries and pneumonias, was invisible to medieval medicine, but the pattern was clearly recognized. Dysentery was the siege's most consistent companion. The flux, as medieval sources called it, the combination of acute diarrheal illness with blood and cramping that we recognize as the symptoms of bacterial and parasitic intestinal infections, was virtually universal in besieged populations after the first month. It killed the very old and the very young with particular efficiency through dehydration that the siege's water constraints made difficult to address. It weakened the garrison soldiers in ways that reduced defensive capacity at exactly the moments when full capacity was most required, and it spread, in the overcrowded conditions of the siege town, with the efficiency of a pathogen in its ideal environment. Typhoid, caused by contaminated water and spread through fecal oral routes, was another consistent presence in the archaeological and documentary record of medieval sieges, identifiable in retrospect from the patterns of death that siege chronicles sometimes record in sufficient detail to diagnose, the characteristic fever that rose and then plateaued, the mental confusion, the specific distribution of death through a community that suggested waterborne transmission rather than direct person-to-person spread. These are recognizable now in accounts that their authors recorded as general pestilence, understood as divine punishment, and treated with prayer and the available pharmacopoeia of medieval medicine. The town's physicians, if it had them, faced a situation for which their training offered limited practical tools. The university-trained physician of the 13th or 14th century possessed a detailed theoretical framework, a pharmacopoeia of herbal and compound preparations, and an approach to diagnosis and treatment that was systematic and internally consistent. It was also, in its core premises about the causes of illness, entirely incorrect. Bleeding the feverish patient to restore the humoral balance disrupted by the illness was standard treatment. It made the patient weaker. Dietary prescriptions, carefully calibrated adjustments to what the patient consumed to correct the presumed humoral imbalance, were applied with care and precision to patients who in many cases were already dangerously malnourished. The treatment aggravated the underlying condition. The medieval physician was not ignorant or careless. He was simply working from a model of disease that had nothing to do with the actual pathology he was trying to address. The monastery or convent within a besieged town, where it existed, typically served as both the primary medical facility and the place where the community's most sophisticated medical knowledge was concentrated. The monastic tradition of herbalism and care for the sick produced practitioners who were, by the standards of their time, highly skilled observers and caregivers. They could not cure the infections that siege conditions produced, but they could manage symptoms, maintain hydration, provide consistent care, and keep records of what worked and what didn't that accumulated over decades into practical knowledge exceeding what the theory suggested. They also died. The monks and nuns who cared for the sick in siege conditions were in constant close contact with the most contagious people in the most infectious environment the siege produced. The mortality among care providers in extended sieges was, in some documented cases, devastating, removing from the community at the worst possible time the people whose skills were most needed. And outside the walls, the besieging army was dying too. No one noted this with particular sympathy in accounts written by the defenders, but it was true. Siege camps were environments of concentrated squalor that generated their own epidemic disease burden, their own dysentery and typhoid, and the other illnesses that proliferated wherever large numbers of people lived in close proximity with inadequate sanitation. The difference was that the besieging force had, at least in principle, access to fresh supplies, clean water from sources beyond the contaminated environment, and the ability to rotate sick men to the rear and bring healthy replacements forward. The town had none of those options. It metabolized its sick where they lay, in the same space as its healthy, breathing the same air, drinking the same water. Disease and the siege wound through each other inextricably, and the town that survived both long enough was the exception, not the rule. The besieged town was not merely a passive organism absorbing punishment. Across the documented history of medieval sieges, the defenders who maintained the best outcomes, who inflicted the greatest cost on the besiegers, who extended the longest resistance, who were most likely to survive until relief arrived, were invariably those who combined strong passive defense with aggressive offensive action outside the walls. The sortie, the sudden armed raid from the town's gates or postern doors into the besieging positions, was the defending garrison's primary means of taking the fight to the enemy. The tactical goals of a sortie varied by circumstance but followed consistent patterns. Destroying siege equipment, the trebuchets, the battering rams, the covered assault tunnels, was the highest value objective, because the loss of a major siege engine represented weeks of construction time and significant material resources for the attacker. Killing engineers and specialist troops who were difficult to replace, the miners, the siege engine operators, the sappers, was similarly high value. Disrupting supply lines, burning supply dumps, killing horses and pack animals. All of these imposed costs that the besieging force had to absorb and recover from. The execution of a sortie required a specific kind of courage that was different from the courage of wall defense. The garrison soldier who held his position under assault was doing something that involved fear, but that also offered the psychological support of fortification, of walls around him, of a defensive structure that gave his effort meaning and protection. The sortie fighter was doing something that involved leaving all of that behind, moving into the open darkness where the enemy was at home and the defender was the intruder, where the numerical disadvantage of the defending garrison, always smaller than the besieging force, was fully exposed. The most effective sortie forces were small, fast, and led by men with accurate intelligence about the enemy's dispositions. They went out through postern doors, small secondary openings in the wall, often hidden or disguised, specifically designed for this purpose, rather than through the main gates, to avoid alerting the enemy positions covering those approaches. They moved in darkness, at the hours when human alertness was lowest, with pre-planned routes to specific targets and pre-planned withdrawal routes back to the postern. They also sometimes did not come back. The mathematics of sortie casualties were brutally simple. A force that killed 10 of the enemy and returned with 5 of its own intact was doing well. The town's leadership, military and civilian, had to manage the psychological dimension of sortie casualties carefully. Every man lost outside the walls was a permanent subtraction from the garrison's defensive capability. Every family whose father or brother did not return from a night sortie was a family with a new grievance, a new grief, a new reason to question whether the resistance that was costing this much was the right choice. The commander who sent men out and lost them was answerable to the community in ways that the formal military hierarchy did not entirely capture. But the alternative to sorties, passive defense, waiting behind the walls while the besiegers systematically destroyed them from outside, was demonstrably worse over time. The siege engines had to be engaged one way or another. The mine operations had to be disrupted. The supply lines had to be taxed. Passive resistance was a strategy of attrition that favoured the attacker. Aggressive sortie operations were among the few means by which the defender could impose costs beyond what the walls themselves inflicted. The chronicles that survive from the garrison perspective, rarer than accounts from the besieging side but present, describe sortie operations with a combination of military precision and barely contained pride that suggests they understood these actions as the expression of the town's refusal to simply absorb what was happening. The sortie was the town fighting back. It was the statement that the people within the walls were not merely waiting to be saved or defeated, but were actively pursuing neither of those outcomes and something more complicated instead. Pride matters in a siege. It is not a substitute for food or water or unbreached walls, but it is a resource that a community under sustained pressure depletes at its peril. The sortie that returned with 2 captured siege engineers and a burned trebuchet was a military success. It was also something else, proof to everyone inside the walls that the town had teeth and that they had been used. Chapter 9b, The God Inside the Walls, Faith, Despair, and the Spiritual Architecture of Siege. Medieval people did not experience the spiritual life of a siege the way that secular modernity imagines they did. The comfortable narrative that faith provided comfort, that prayer gave solace, that the church's rituals soothed the community's fear, is not incorrect, but it is incomplete in ways that matter for understanding what was actually happening in the churches and chapels and street corner shrines of a besieged medieval town. Medieval faith was not a private emotional state that one carried to church and expressed in prayer. It was an operating theory of how the world worked, one in which divine intervention was a real mechanism, not a metaphor, and in which the outcome of a siege was genuinely subject to supernatural influence that could be courted, offended, or placated. This meant that the spiritual practices of a besieged town were not merely psychological management. They were a form of tactical action. The saints were not, to the medieval mind, historical figures whose intercession was poetically invoked. They were powerful entities with specific areas of influence and documented track records of intervention in human affairs that the town's inhabitants knew, as well as they knew the histories of their own families. Saint Sebastian, who had survived being shot through with arrows, was the obvious intercessor for a garrison under projectile assault. Saint Barbara, patron of those who worked with explosives and artillery, whose cultic prominence grew during precisely the period when siege artillery became dominant in medieval warfare, was petitioned at the walls where the catapults were most active. Local saints, whose particular relationship to this specific place gave them special interest in its outcome, received the most fervent attention. The relics housed in the town's churches were, in this framework, not merely sacred objects, but instruments of potential protection, physical points of contact with divine power that could be activated by proper veneration and petitioning. Their presence within the walls, or their absence, was understood to have direct implications for the town's survival prospects. Towns whose most important relics had been removed, evacuated before the siege began, taken out with the bishop's party when the bishop left, sometimes interpreted this removal as an omen of divine abandonment that affected garrison morale in ways the military command could do nothing about. And sometimes the relics were brought out and processed around the walls themselves. This ritual, well documented in siege accounts from across the medieval period, was simultaneously a religious act and a public one. The statement to God and saints and the watching community that the town was placing itself under heavenly protection, and the statement to the community that the leadership had deployed its most serious spiritual resources, the clergy walking the circuit of the walls with the town's most important relics, were performing something that everyone watching understood as the maximum available spiritual commitment. Whether it worked is the question the modern reader asks. It is not the question the medieval participant was asking. They knew it worked. The question was whether they had performed it correctly, whether the community's sins had not outweighed its merits, whether the specific saint being invoked had sufficient power over the specific threat they faced. The framework was not whether divine intervention was possible, but whether they had done everything necessary to obtain it. This is a different relationship to prayer than the modern one, and it produced a different kind of desperation when the prayers seemed unanswered. The theology of suffering available to the medieval believer was complex, but its most practically important component in siege conditions was the understanding of affliction as potentially meaningful, as potentially a form of divine testing, divine punishment for collective sin, or the suffering that preceded redemption. A community that was suffering was not necessarily one that had been abandoned. It might be one that was being purified, or tested, or punished for specific offences that could be identified and corrected. This framework gave the community something to do with its suffering, which was important. It also created a mechanism for blame that siege conditions could activate with devastating results. If the town was being punished for collective sin, then the sins of individual community members could be understood as contributing to the punishment of everyone. The person whose hidden vice was destroying the community. The community's failure to prosecute heresy, or to properly observe the Sabbath, or to support the church's institutions with sufficient generosity, or to do any number of things that the clergy could identify as deficiencies now that the siege provided the evidence that divine displeasure was active. The witch accusation was the extreme form of this logic, the identification of a specific individual within the community as the supernatural cause of the community's suffering, someone who had invited or enabled the siege through dealings with powers opposed to the saints being petitioned. Siege accounts from the later medieval period, particularly those associated with periods of extended shortage or disease, occasionally record accusations made against specific individuals within besieged towns that follow this pattern. The accused were almost always already marginalized, women of ambiguous social status, men who had been publicly visible in unpopular roles, anyone whose behavior could be retrospectively framed as suspicious. The community that turned on one of its own members in this way was a community whose internal cohesion was already under fatal strain. The accusation was a symptom as much as a cause, the sign that the social trust necessary to hold a siege community together was dissolving, and that the dissolution was seeking a target. The clergy who maintained their function through these escalating pressures were performing one of the most demanding acts available in medieval society, sustaining the ritual and pastoral structures that gave the community its spiritual coherence, while navigating the political and social dynamics that the siege imposed, while themselves experiencing the same fear and shortage and exhaustion as everyone else around them. The monk who continued to celebrate the offices, matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, compline, when the canonical hours were the only reliable structure left in the collapsing normal time of siege, was doing something that his community needed more than they could articulate. The priest who stayed at his parish and did not flee with the bishop was making a choice whose consequences he understood. The spiritual architecture of the siege, the masses, the processions, the relics, the confessions, the deathbed rites administered to garrison soldiers and starving civilians alike, was the infrastructure of meaning that ran underneath the military and material drama of the siege itself. Without it, the siege was simply suffering without framework. With it, the suffering was something that could at least be addressed, confessed, directed, offered to a witness who might respond. For many of the people inside the walls, it was the most important thing happening, more important than the catapults, more immediate than the food supply. The conviction that the universe contained a structure in which their suffering was visible and significant, that they were not simply random elements in a military operation, but souls whose situation was known, was the resource that the siege could damage but never fully destroy because it did not require anything outside the walls to sustain it. It was entirely their own, and in a siege, what was entirely your own was the most precious thing you possessed. Medieval siege warfare had a formalized language of capitulation that was both practically useful and profoundly revealing about the social assumptions of the period. The decision to negotiate, and therefore to eventually surrender, was not a simple one, and it did not always originate with a garrison command. In a medieval town, where the population had both a stake in the outcome and some form of representative voice through guilds, prominent families, or municipal councils, the question of when to open negotiations was a genuinely contested political question rather than a purely military one. The garrison commander might believe the walls could hold for another month. The merchants whose businesses were being destroyed might disagree, or the clergy whose parish was starving might present a petition for terms, or the families whose men on the walls were dying might make their views known in ways that could not be ignored. The threshold question was, what terms could be obtained, and were they better than continued resistance? Medieval siege conventions provided a structured framework for these negotiations that both sides, most of the time, had practical incentives to respect. A town that surrendered by formal negotiation before being taken by storm could expect a defined set of protections: the lives of the garrison and civilian population, the security of private property above certain minimum thresholds, the freedom of the garrison to depart under safe conduct. In return, the besieger received the town intact, a functional settlement, productive farmland, a population capable of generating tax revenue, rather than a burned ruin full of bodies. These conventions were not, it must be emphasized, humanitarian achievements. They were practical ones. The medieval besieger who chose to sack a surrendered town was exercising a recognized legal right. If the town had held out past the conventional point where resistance was deemed futile, it had forfeited the protections of negotiated surrender. The sack was not a breakdown of order, but the application of a recognized sanction. Its deterrent purpose, encouraging early capitulation in subsequent sieges, was part of its logic. The negotiations themselves were conducted through formal intermediaries, typically under some form of truce, a herald going out from the gates under a flag of parley, the herald from the besieging force meeting him at a defined neutral point. The terms discussed would cover the specific conditions of surrender: the date, the manner of opening the gates, the treatment of garrison personnel, the fate of the town's property, the status of individuals who might have political reasons to fear the incoming authority. The hardest negotiations were the ones that failed. When negotiations failed, when the besieger's terms were unacceptable, or when internal politics within the town prevented any settlement from being reached, or when the leadership was ideologically or personally committed to resistance regardless of terms, the assault became inevitable, and both sides knew it. That foreknowledge was, in its own way, another dimension of the siege's psychological toll. The garrison soldier who had held the walls for 6 weeks, who was hungry and sick and worn through with sleeplessness, knew that if negotiations broke down, everything he had endured was still not the worst of it. The civilians who had rationed their bread and their water and watched their children grow thin knew that the assault on the walls, if it came, would bring into the town the thing that the walls had been holding back. The period following the breakdown of negotiations and before the final assault was documented in several chronicles as a time of particular emotional intensity within the besieged town. Last masses said with unusual fervour, Wills dictated. Final meals shared with a deliberateness that made them commemorative rather than merely alimentary. Letters written to people outside the walls who would never receive them or would receive them too late. The specific grief of communities that understood they were in the final chapter of something. The fall of a medieval town by storm was not the cinematic event that popular imagination has made of it. It was, in practice, violent, chaotic, loud, and often surprisingly fast. Once the breach was made and the defending line inside it began to give way, the dynamics changed rapidly. The discipline that had held the garrison together for weeks or months could dissolve in minutes when the physical structure of the defence was breached, when the clear spatial definition between defender and attacker, the wall between us and them, was suddenly absent. The breach fight itself was typically a brutal, close-quarters engagement in rubble, and confined space that bore little resemblance to either the carefully staged assault depicted in manuscript illustrations or the romantic individual combat of chivalric literature. Attackers poured through a gap that neither side controlled fully. Defenders attempted to hold a position in crumbling masonry with limited ability to move, reinforce, or retreat. The advantage swung toward the attacker simply because the attacker had more people and could accept higher losses in the moment of breakthrough. What followed the breach depended on factors that the defenders could not control and could only partially anticipate. The orders that the attacking commander had given his troops, the discipline of those troops, the nature of any prior negotiations that had failed, the political context of the siege, the degree to which the defenders had been perceived as having prolonged resistance beyond what honour or pragmatism required. A sack was not a uniform event. It was an aggregate of thousands of individual events occurring simultaneously across the seized town, each one shaped by the specific character and condition of the attacker and the defender involved. Some attackers killed immediately. Some took prisoners for ransom, a practice that made economic sense for identifiable members of the wealthy class. Some looted with systematic efficiency. Some were swept into violence by the cumulative emotion of a long campaign and the sudden release of adrenaline that the breach had triggered. The town that fell by storm became, in those hours, a place without rules, which meant a place where everything depended on who happened to be in front of you. The church offered a qualified sanctuary that was recognized in medieval law and partially respected in practice. An attacker who violated church sanctuary, who forced the doors of a church in which civilians had taken refuge and committed violence inside, was technically committing a significant breach of canon law and could face ecclesiastical penalties. This deterrent was real but inconsistent, and its effectiveness depended heavily on the religious identity of the attacking force, the degree of discipline the commander had managed to maintain, and the economics of the situation. A church full of wealthy townspeople represented a valuable ransom pool that gave some commanders a practical incentive to control their troops. The church's protection worked better for the wealthy than for the poor, which was consistent with most things in the medieval world. What happened after the storm took hold, in the days that followed, was the renegotiation of the town's existence. The new authority moved in, assessed what it had acquired, imposed its own administrative order on what remained. The surviving population adapted to the new reality with the human capacity for adaptation that every such event in every period has demonstrated. Remarkable, terrible, and not quite the same as resilience. The possibility of relief was, for many besieged towns, the central organizing principle of their resistance. Not the walls, not the food stores, not the garrison's fighting quality. These were the material conditions of survival, but the psychological engine that drove resistance was the belief, or the hope, or eventually the mere possibility, that forces were coming from outside to break the siege. The relief army was the future the town was buying time to reach. This calculation was never simple. A town's leadership had to assess with very imperfect information whether relief was actually coming and when it might arrive, and compare that timeline to the time that existing supplies could sustain. Too optimistic an assessment of relief timelines led towns to hold out past the point where any terms could have been negotiated, into the condition of a storm and sack. Too pessimistic an assessment led to surrenders that relief forces, arriving days later, would have made unnecessary. Communication between a besieged town and the outside world was one of the most practically difficult problems the garrison faced. The standard methods, messenger, rider, signal fire, were all vulnerable to the perimeter that the besieging force maintained around the town. Getting a message out required either stealth or sacrifice. A messenger who went out by night through a postern, by stealth, hoping not to be caught, or a swimmer who attempted the river route, or a man on a fast horse at a gate that opened briefly enough to let him through but not long enough to admit a pursuit. Carrier pigeons were used, where they had been established in advance. A town that had anticipated the possibility of siege and placed trained carrier pigeons at its garrison before the investment could receive messages from outside in a way that the besieging force could intercept only by shooting the birds, which required both awareness and accuracy that was not always available. The messages that came in by pigeon, or that the town somehow managed to send out by messenger, were the fragments of outside reality that the town received, and their content shaped everything. A message confirming that a relief force was assembling and would arrive in 3 weeks meant 3 weeks more of rations had to be found. A message confirming that the overlord had been defeated in the field elsewhere, that no relief was coming, that the town's political masters had negotiated a separate peace that did not include the garrison. That message was a different kind of document entirely. The armies that never came are not recorded in any chronicle, because they never arrived. But the towns that held for them and lost are recorded everywhere. The arrival of a relief force, when it came, was one of the most documented emotional events in siege chronicles, precisely because the contrast with the preceding weeks made it maximally legible. The garrison that had held, the civilian population that had endured, the walls that had somehow not fallen. The relief that arrived from outside found a town transformed by what it had absorbed. The physical transformation was visible, the walls scarred, sections repaired with improvised masonry, the buildings near the walls damaged or destroyed, the people thinner, quieter, moving differently than they had before the gates closed, the faces that had become accustomed to the particular economy of siege, to calculating each calorie and each hour of rest, to the daily arithmetic of survival, confronting the sudden surplus of relief with something that took time to fully become joy. Some never did. The trauma of a siege that had lasted long enough to watch people die, long enough to endure what the later chapters would have brought, long enough that the normal world began to feel like something that had happened to a different person, did not dissolve when the relief army broke through the encircling positions. It went underground. It became part of what the person carried, folded into the silence they maintained about the worst of what they had seen. available for the rest of their lives to come forward in the night, when the wind sounded a certain way, or when the bells rang at a certain pitch. The stones of medieval fortified towns are among the most persistent artifacts in the European landscape. They do not explain themselves. The wall section embedded in the side of a restaurant, the tower incorporated into a later house, the gate archway that now frames a pedestrian shopping street. These fragments do not announce what they absorbed, what sounds they heard, what weight of human experience pressed against them from the inside during the weeks and months when they were all that stood between a community and catastrophe. The medieval town that survived a siege was changed by it in ways that outlasted the immediate crisis. The physical repairs were visible for decades. The patched masonry, the improvised construction that replaced what the artillery had destroyed, the buildings whose foundations showed the scorch marks of the fires that had not quite taken hold. The human repairs took longer. We know the siege of a particular town in the Rhineland in 1268 lasted 43 days. We know this from the chronicle of a monk in a house 2 valleys over, who recorded the smoke he could see from his window and the information brought by refugees. We do not know, from that chronicle, the name of the woman who organized the water distribution in the eastern quarter and kept 112 people alive through the final week of the siege, when the cisterns were almost dry. She is not in the record. We know from a pension application filed in 1347 with the municipal authorities of a French town that a man named Girard, son of Bertrand the candlemaker, had been partially blinded in his left eye during a siege 17 years earlier and was requesting relief from his annual guild tax on those grounds. We do not know what he saw in those 17 years since, when the memory came back uninvited. The pension application does not go into that. We know from an inquest record of 1312 that a man in an Italian hill town was convicted of hoarding grain during the siege of the previous year, and that the punishment was a public whipping and the confiscation of his entire property, which was then distributed to the families of 4 garrison soldiers who had died during the siege. We know their names from the inquest. We do not know if the distribution felt like justice or merely mathematics to the people who received it. The record gives us the arithmetic. The experience lives in the spaces between the numbers. The medieval besieged town teaches what all extremity teaches, which is that the ordinary machinery of human life, the eating and sleeping and worrying and arguing and hoping and praying and caring for each other, and occasionally failing to care enough, does not stop when circumstances become extraordinary. It continues, in reduced and distorted form, under the pressure of whatever the world has brought to bear against it. The baker baking smaller loaves with coarser grain is still baking. The mother counting the days is still counting. The guard on the wall is still watching, still listening, still performing the human act of attention, directed toward a horizon that may or may not resolve into salvation. The siege ends one way or another. The gates open, or they are forced. The relief arrives, or it doesn't. The town survives, or it becomes a different kind of story. But while it lasts, inside the walls, in the daily terror and the daily endurance, something is preserved that no chronicle quite captures and no ruin quite shows. The ordinary human being, under extraordinary pressure, still present, still trying, still alive. For now, for today, for this hour on the wall, while the light holds. This was Where the Stones Bled. Thank you for watching. If this film moved you, if somewhere in these stones you recognize something, leave a comment below. Subscribe to Worlds Before Us for more cinematic deep dives into the lives of people history almost forgot. And if you want to be there when we release our next long journey into the ancient world, hit the bell. We'll be waiting for you.